seemed all very nice and lovely. But the question I really want to ask you, some of you saw, I think you have it, Kent, the cover of The Economist, where it says the age of the Anthropocene. We clearly live in a human-dominated landscape. So my first question to this panel would be, what are we really trying to do with restoration? Is it restoration? Is it recreation? If we're recreating, then what are we recreating? Is it rewilding? Or are we creating something entirely new? The Anthropocene, perhaps, or something entirely new we're going to live amongst. Who'd like to take that? What are we actually trying to do with restorations of ecosystems?
I'll dive in for starters and suggest that there's not a single answer. I think that there are at least 4 considerations in thinking about that question. The first is context. Some of the restoration efforts we have underway are all on working landscapes. What you're going to do on those landscapes is going to be very different than, say, what you're going to try to do in the Everglades, where you are working on a very large scale and really trying to reintroduce some natural system functions. But secondly, I would suggest that this question about goal, what are we trying to do, rewild, recreate, restore, also has a significant values dimension to it. This is not simply a question for science, but again, you have human communities. If I go down to the Everglades, you have a situation there where you've got the Miccosukee tribe and some of its historic uses of the land and preferences. You've got long-standing recreational uses in the park. You now have Miami, which has changed that landscape, so you're operating on about 1/3 of what used to be the Everglades. So you have a mix of value plays in there that will also affect that answer. 2 other quick dimensions. Obviously, science plays a significant role in thinking about that question in the sense of understanding what the landscape looks like, what that Anthropocene landscape looks like, what's possible. And let me go back to the Everglades. You're working on 1/3 of the landscape. Is it even possible to restore that landscape in anything that looks like what it was pre-plumbing? And then the final issue I will mention is economics, the very prosaic dimension here. But using Everglades as an example again, while I was at Interior, we were asking the question, how much water flow, with what timing, to achieve what results? And the scientists in that analysis suggested if we wanted to get the Everglades to look and feel somewhat like what it had been pre-plumbing, we would need a 17-mile bridge that would allow, over the Tamiami Trail, to allow that much water to flow. Well, the price tag was billions of dollars, and it simply was not going to be acceptable politically to expend that kind of money. So we made a compromise and ended up with a 1-mile bridge and a 2-mile bridge. So I think, context, values, science, and economy all blend into answering that question.
Okay. Wow, hands are going up. I'm going to go this way, and then I'm going to come to you, Ken. Is that okay?
It's fine.
All right.
And then me.
And then I'll come to you. Okay. So Lynn made a proposition about what we're trying to do, and one word that she mentioned, values, really stuck in my mind. What are we trying to do, and is this really a values question? Because that's the word that really jumped from me.
So if for certain it's a values question, but I think there's also a little bit of science behind it. And the science, I would say, is that, I hate the word restoration ecology and restoring. I think if you are honest as a scientist, and in the field of restoration ecology, if you looked at the leading thinkers in it, there's an undercurrent. They would say we shouldn't even use the word restoration anymore. Cannot be done. We are designing ecosystems. That's what we're doing. We're designing ecosystems. We're designing ecosystems, that's what the science tells us. It tells us the constraints on it, and we can do them for many purposes.
Are we designing ecosystems? Do you use the word restoration?
So, trying to figure out whether or not I want to be polite and answer your question or go to the point I wanted to make.
Answer quickly and then go to your point. It's okay.
No, I don't use the word restoration. I think that restoration is like buying indulgences. If you remember in the Catholic Church, when you were going to sin, you knew you didn't want to stop sinning. You just wanted to go pay somebody so you'd feel better about it. And I think that's what it is. It's, we don't want to say we're sorry. We don't want to stop doing what we're doing. So we invented this thing which largely doesn't work and really isn't going to constrain what we want to do, but we can take people there and say, see, I'm a good person, I'm a good citizen. So whatever you call it, I don't think it's an honest view about standing up and facing the costs and consequences of the choices we make in destroying things.
And your point on the bigger question, or is that it?
That it's all values, but in this case, the value is guilt.
Okay. So are we buying absolution in terms of restoration? And when you answer that, I also want you to tell us about a favorite restoration project that you might have in your mind, just to give the audience some sense of what it is we're thinking, because we're all using a word and we have some mental image in it. So let's at least explain one.
So I don't even think about the indulgence aspect of this. I mean, I just don't. On one level, I think because the human imprint is on every ecosystem on the planet, that anything we do in natural resource management or conservation is somehow restoration. But I also think it's a very different game given the trajectories the biosphere is on and the atmosphere and all the rest of it. So we're going to have to think of it in a very different way. It's not taking something back to a particular state. It may be more about restoring function. So I think what we really need to do is think about restoring some stability to the functioning of the biosphere. So favorite example, the Tijuca forest in Rio. Right?
Okay.
First tropical reforestation project, the largest urban forest in the tropics, started by the emperor because the watershed was going to hell. You can still see exotic species in that forest, but it's a functioning tropical forest.
So you mentioned exotic species. Why were you laughing?
That's where I was headed.
Okay.
You were just looking at
So what's the role of alien species versus invasive species? How much effort should we put in removing alien species? I mean, the Nature Conservancy spent an enormous amount of money taking goats, pigs, and then eagles off Santa Cruz Island in order to restore some of the habitat and the fox. Extraordinary amounts of effort and time and political capital. What do you think the role of alien invasive species is in restoration? Is that a big part of what you think of as restoration, getting rid of stuff that shouldn't be there?
Well, this is why I think Lynn's absolutely right about the values question, because what you want determines what you're going to do. And so if you take Tom literally at what he said, and I don't know that he meant this, but I'll take it literally for the sake of argument, about restoring function, then who cares what the species is? If you're producing the clean water that you want, I don't care. If you're producing the carbon sequestration, fine. In fact, maybe we don't even need plants. Maybe we'll have these carbon scrubbing, quote, trees that Professor at Columbia set up. Maybe we need genetically modified alder because we don't care, because all we're doing is carbon. So if you take just the function part and you do the restoration, we're going to end up in some places that we need to understand we'll be headed if we are making a single choice and emphasizing a certain kind of function.
But Kent, that's too narrow a view of function. I think when we design our ecosystems, we do it for many reasons, and we could do them creative. I think we're all understanding it's a creative enterprise, and we could do it. The Santa Cruz Island, we did it really because of the island fox, and there was a particular endemic biodiversity value that we wanted to achieve. If the only way we could do that is with invasive species, we might have done it. And so that was one objective. In other places, the objectives might be nitrogen elimination, and then you might bring in whatever plant gets rid of nitrogen. In other situations, there's examples where invasive species saved other species from extinction. So there could be more than one use of our designed ecosystems. We have enormous creative potential. Science gives us the possibility. Values gives us what we want.
Yeah, I want to add to the discussion and suggest I don't think the answer to that question is not is the switch on or off. It again is a very contextual one. It depends on the goals, what you're trying to do in a particular place, but it also depends on the possibilities. And so let me give two contrasting examples. One that I had thought of, Santa Barbara being my home, was indeed the Nature Conservancy National Park Service effort on Santa Cruz Island. There you had an island, and you had, based on input from the science, the possibility of actually succeeding given the goals that were set forth. It seems to me that was a case in which tackling the invasives was a worthwhile effort. When I look, by contrast, at let's say cheatgrass in the Great Basin, you've got millions of acres. Now with cheatgrass, it is changing the fire regime in the area, but you have to ask, how successful are you likely to be to try and tackle a problem that's that extensive? And does that, if you're constrained on what you might be able to accomplish, perhaps you have to change your goals or re-examine them.
So recently, the Teague report came out, and it places a huge emphasis on restoration. And it makes that emphasis on restoration because restoration as a model for climate regulation, ecosystem services, and so on and so forth. It seems to me that restoration today is much less about bringing back a particular species in a place or a particular set of species. And when policymakers think about it, they think about restoration in terms of restoring something in order to provide services, and that has huge value. Do you see that as a change?
Yeah, I do agree with that. I mean, just the total human impact on the biotic systems of the planet are so great that we have to be thinking at a different scale. Just, I would say that a lot of the people in the game have yet to think on the scale of the problem of the impact. So that's why I think about ecosystem restoration, however you want to define that, as a really important way to pull some CO2 out of the atmosphere, put connections back in the living landscape, make it easier for biodiversity to move around as the climate changes. Which doesn't mean I don't value a particular species in a particular place. But it's a brave new world for us.
And thinking about it as that brave new world, some of the things that you call restoration are going to be entirely novel. You're not restoring anything. I mean, you can think about nitrogen, overloading nitrogen in dead zone. A reasonable solution to that might be putting wetlands, along the Mississippi River to take out the nitrogen. That's not restoring anything that was there before. That's
putting some of them back would be a good idea.
Yeah, but I'm talking to Upper Mississippi. Yeah. And so there's opportunities for actually, at the grand scale of doing things that are not necessarily even recovering something. They're having to put something new in because we've created such a new scale of problems.
Actually, it reminds me of the Global 2000 report to the president in 1980, and I was working on one piece of it, and I read the part about wetlands, and I went back to them, and I said, it seems to me that wetlands are so important. We should not only be saving all the ones we have, we should be making more of them. Right? Yep. It didn't get in the report.
I wanted to move it. Did you want to add a quick word to that?
Well, I just wanted to suggest that I don't think creating these new systems is simply a matter of scale, but also very significantly pertains to the question of resilience. And I think of the Nature Conservancy and some of your river projects that you're doing with the Army Corps of Engineers, in which the rivers and the Army Corps have managed those systems historically for flood control and water storage. Working with the Corps, TNC is getting them to actually restore some floodplain, restore perhaps not to some previous condition, but at least emulating the functions of a floodplain, and rethinking the operation of those hard infrastructure human systems. But part of the reason is one of resilience. That is, that restored floodplain can operate can function over a broader range of conditions than the hard infrastructure, for example. And that's important where you have climate change and perhaps much more highly variable operating conditions.
So this side of the room seems to have now migrated firmly into putting something back or creating something sometimes completely novel in order to focus on the services that are provided, flood control, climate, nitrogen, so on and so forth. What about the critters? You work on bison restoration in the prairies, not necessarily always popular. Can you speak to that?
The
Is
not
there a
always
role for
popular
that?
part, modified me or the bison part? Sorry. No, I mean, I think it's critical that when you talk about the resilience, though, we are not willing to leave in place the same space for resilience that would have been there prior to that human regulation. So, yeah, the river work is great, working with the Army Corps of Engineers, but you still have to allow the Army Corps of Engineers to deliver the values that they want in creating these wetlands. You're not able to say, except possibly with this dam, take the whole damn thing out, as it were. And it's best shown in, I thought this word was pronounced Anthropocene, but everybody here in Colorado, of all places, chooses to pronounce it Anthropocene, as if they've just gotten off the plane from London, which some of you may have. Maybe the jet from London. Anyway, the point is that in the Anthropocene, they have this lovely little figure here about the nitrogen cycle. And they have a figure in 1890, atmospheric nitrogen, 15 megatons to farms. In 1990, 118 megatons, so from 15 to 18, and then 21 to industrial combustion. So we have completely reworked the global nitrogen cycle. Why? Because it suits our needs. So if you try to restore the 1890 nitrogen cycle, we don't stand a chance of doing that. So, we're willing to talk about resilience, but only kind of because we're worried about what we wanted to get out of it no longer being what we could get out of it. And to your question then about the animals.
Why are you trying to put bison back into the prairies?
So,
in Nebraska, of all places.
Bison numbered between 30 and 50 million in the 1700s. That number dropped to fewer than 200 in the wild by the late 1800s. And through the actions of a set of individuals and institutions, the bison was prevented from demographic extinction. So now there are approximately 490,000 bison, North American bison, not European bison, 490 North American bison. 97% of them are in private hands being raised for meat. So the question about restoration in the case of bison is not a species restoration, because the species per se is not endangered. But what is endangered and virtually extinct is the connection between bison and the ecosystem, such that it's playing some sort of interactive role, and that is what we're interested in restoring. Now, that being said, we've created a way of thinking about it so that even if you're a small producer in Iowa with bison, you have the potential to contribute to that ecological restoration. Clearly not in the same ways that the folks who are reintroducing wood bison into Alaska are able to do. So in Alaska is one of the few places where you're going to be able to see lightning-killed bison. You're going to be able to see bison left dead so that all of the scavengers can have it, as opposed to going to your local Whole Foods and sold in Aspen Institute restaurant. You'll be able to have bison, you'll be able to have wolves and grizzlies, what have you. In Iowa, you're not going to have that. But it doesn't mean you couldn't use fire and some kinds of grazing regimes and increase local wildflowers or even pollinator diversity. So it attempts to be a politically informed restoration project that respects the different extent to which human influence can be modified over the course of a restoration effort.
All right, so he's putting bison back, but he's not willing to go all the way and at this point introduce wolves and bears and all the other things. What do you think? Not at this point, right?
You said I'm not willing to. I'm willing to.
Oh, no, right. Okay. The institution you represent, and because of the very real concerns you've said. So it's clearly a difficult proposition to restore some of these animals back into systems. What do you think ought to be the proportion of effort that goes into protecting a place that already has this? Yellowstone ecosystem, for example, versus restoring it in a place that it doesn't, when you know that what you're putting in is only a part of the puzzle? How do you allocate?
So I think the way you have to allocate it is recognize that even is to look at it globally, or at some grand scale, look at it globally and say, what are we trying to achieve? And you decide what you're trying to achieve, and when you do that, everybody recognizes you can't do it just with protection. I mean, that's why the Teague report came out with that. So everybody recognizes that. And then you come up with a series of different efforts to meet different needs. But you have to, you actually, you can't do it one prairie at a time. You actually can't. It's like with the rivers. When people are trying to American rivers and people are talking about getting wild rivers again. You don't go at getting wild rivers and taking dams out to restore rivers, one river and one dam at a time. You go and say, we have 50,000 dams. We're going to have rivers, and these rivers are going to have many functions. Some of them are going to be for wild salmon. Some of them are going to be for hydroelectric. Some of them are going to be for irrigation. What is it that as a nation we want our river system to look at? So my point is, and that's why I think of it as designing it. We're designing ecosystems to meet, society's needs, of which some of it is these intact ecosystems which have, satisfy goals of a lot of people. But you don't do it one system at a time. Because if you do it one system at a time, you'll end up misallocating your resources.
So as the recovering policymaker in the group, let me introduce...
So, Kent is a recovering UC Santa Cruz graduate, so...
Not really recovering.
So, in this discussion of species reintroduction, let's take the example of the California condor for a moment. 25 years ago, the species down to just a handful. A huge debate at the time, incidentally, on whether the species ought to die a graceful death and or whether they ought to be brought into captivity and bred and then put back into the wild. Tremendous cost. And perhaps unlike the bison and unlike wolves in Yellowstone, arguably their presence back into a highly altered ecosystem is not really changing that landscape or restoring it. And indeed, it looks like from discussions with Fish and Wildlife Service that at least in some locations, they will need to continue to put out food because there's simply insufficient carrion for them to survive. A lot of cost, and each of those dollars, of course, is an opportunity cost. It's something, therefore, left undone or not done. So I'd be interested in what the panelists think about those kinds of trade-offs decisions. Now, for me, as a birder, there's something extraordinarily spiritual about seeing those birds back in the wild and having them be part of this landscape. Mm-hmm. But is that a sufficient reason, that I, the birder, like to see these magnificent and graceful birds out there, to expend that kind of scarce dollar, and particularly now when we have such constraints on conservation dollars available?
So Tom go and then Kent.
So my answer to that would be yes. Americans have all different kinds of bird feeders, right? But I think the important point here is that it is a magnificent animal. I think at least some of the initial money that was available for it was available only for it. It wasn't taking away from anything else. So I think it's a great thing.
So Tom's firmly on the yes side.
I'm a let them go person. I mean, that a set of these animals, I don't know all of them, they have to be caught every 2 years and have a chelation treatment because of ongoing lead. I mean, is that a wild animal? Every 2 years, catch them up, take them to the vet, have to do that. So you saw in the paper the 3 animals that died most recently died from lead poisoning. You know what that's about? This is a huge fight going on in this country now about whether we're willing to replace hunter ammunition that's lead with copper-based, copper-sheathed ammunition, which can be sold for a little bit more It has the same kind of penetrating power. It has the same everything. But you should see, if you're interested, Ted Williams wrote a column in Audubon Magazine about the attempts to try and replace lead ammunition in this country. There's just no political will. So
They did so in California.
No, they did so in California only in the areas which were regarded as the prime feeding areas. But these condors, any kind of success is going to see condors spreading out, unless they like the process of being brought into this little chelation treatment and kind of like that, which is... Anyway, so look at the price per dollar, and the New Zealand government has got this right. The New Zealand government has got a national effort that is looking at the cost and the return for every dollar spent on all of its endangered species. And it intends to allocate all of the endangered species money based on an allocation for the best return on investment. Condors would never make that list.
Name me one thing they're willing to let go in New Zealand.
I don't know.
That's the thing. It's there, but they're not willing to. I mean, you take something like a giant, blind, slightly smelly, large ground parrot, which is really not doomed for much success in life. And the extraordinary amounts of conservation efforts that go on to trying to save the kakapo. Sorry, what do you think?
About what?
Oh no, you were on the firmly on the side of yes, 2 yeses, 1 no.
I'm going to waffle. So, I mean, the U.S., publicly made a commitment to the Endangered Species Act. Remember, it was unanimous in the Senate, Republicans, Democrats, everything. So that was a unanimous political decision of a democracy, to protect species. But given the budget to do that, we probably do need a system of triage. Because we want to protect as many species as possible, and what you're really talking about, Kat, is triage. Sometimes it's too expensive. I'm not sure that the condor will fail. I'm not sure it's that expensive against the context of, we spend money on engineering projects, that are 100 times greater than that are more foolish.
But Peter, that money is not fungible.
It is partly fungible.
You can also compare it to the Iraq War, which is always the one that people do.
Some of that is fungible. But for the question I would make about the condor is not its immediate. What in 50 years is its potential, for getting through it, and then how unique is it? I would have a sort of a uniqueness thing, a uniqueness as a phylogenetic line, and it would be good for our community to think about this uniqueness thing, because I think that's part of something we care about.
Let me lob another question to my panelists, and that is, who decides? And I don't mean in the species triage, but more broadly, if restoration is about values at some level, what goals are we after? Is it resilience and some sort of restoration of ecosystem function? Is it the sustenance of biodiversity and wildlife? There are a lot of goals in play. So who decides? And let me just give an example. Klamath. So there were 28 different entities, and I mean every county and the 3 states that were involved, 4 of the 5 tribes involved in that particular ecosystem, spent years after the huge conflict in the early 2000s on water and water use, came to an agreement in principle to fallow some land and essentially restore some wetland functions, remove 4 dams. And that local collection of people made that determination. There was a national blessing of it. One outlier entity that did not like that concept has dived into the Congress and tried to get the entire effort defunded. So I give that example not to discuss it, but to ask the question, who decides when we make these triage decisions, when we decide to spend a ton of money taking 4 dams out, et cetera, et cetera?
So, I think it's not only that issue, it's also how we decide. And I really think that we've done a miserable job of designing or using an economic system that reflects some of the values from the natural world. And that's why I like the T report so very much.
By the way, can you tell them what the T
So,
three times.
yeah, it's the third time the acronym has been used, right? Let me just back up and put it in context. When the Stern report came out on the economics of climate change, a meeting of environment ministers of the G8 reacted to it and said, we need something like this for biodiversity and ecosystems. So it's the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. It is not about putting a price on nature, as some people have said and taken offense at. It is trying to bring a lot of the value into the way we make decision making. And it's feeding right into the green economy efforts and the things that will ultimately go to Rio plus 20. And so without eating up too much of the rest of our time, you look at a choice like taking down mangroves to do shrimp aquaculture or not. And if you really do the economics right and recognize those values, you never would go near it. So that's one of the really important things we need to push on, because otherwise we're going to let the system shove us in the direction of making more of or allowing some more of these unfortunate downsides.
So what I propose to do is open this up a little bit more and have folks pitch questions for the panel. I will either direct it. If you can direct it specifically, that's fine. If you're going to make a comment, I ask you to make it briefly in the form of a question. John?
Okay, well, Peter Kareiva won't be surprised by my question, because I've already quoted in a review in Nature saying essentially that history is bunk. My question is, this is a panel about restoration, and neither in the 4 criteria nor in any of the conversation was there any mention of history. Restoration is one of the most important cultural ideas in history. Religion, culture, art. Environmental history is about the possibilities of nature, but also the possibilities of human-nature relations. And so why would you abandon this very powerful concept? The bison is a powerful symbol, as is the condor. I worry about you launching into this brave new world of design unmoored from history.
Okay. Who would like?
Well, thank you for that. And actually, when I use the word values, and perhaps we use this differently among us, I include in that the value set of acknowledging, sustaining, and advancing our cultures and history. And indeed, a lot of the discussion about Everglades restoration and asking the question, what is the end point of that effort, centers on the history of that landscape and the associated cultural actions that connect with that. So I think history is very much a part of that dialogue, and frankly, I think the condor, perhaps that discussion fits into that picture as well.
So John, what I'd say is that my concern is the danger of backcasting as forecasting. And I think that's what I've learned is forget about it. That we can't look backwards as a way to help us look forwards. And, you said art history. It was a surprise to me to learn about the huge fights about cleaning the Sistine Chapel or even cleaning the Statue of David. People can't even agree on something that was made by a known human being at a certain time as to what it ought to be done, whether it should be cleaned or not, so what are we supposed to do about a natural world where we have made many more modifications and we're not even aware of what they all are?
Great. Stuart?
I like that Thomas brought up the scale issue. And with climate change, basically, we're looking at the whole planet, ecosystem stuff, we're looking at whole continents. In a book I read rather recently, that I should have read it earlier, was The Eternal Frontier by Tim Flannery, Wonderful Ecological History of North America. One thing that was in there that I hadn't really caught is that our north-south mountain ranges, like this one, turn North America into a climate amplifier. And all these tornadoes we're seeing currently are a classic case of that. So we've got North America's north-south ranges, Appalachian, Sierra, and so on. amplifies the climate, means that the plant and animal species are going to be under even more stress here than elsewhere with climate change. But we also have these potential enormous wildlife corridors going north and south in each of the mountain ranges. And we even have hiking trails up most of them. So is there a macro scheme that has an aspect of restoration, an aspect of climate amelioration, and an aspect of realizing that invasive is actually a neutral term in ecology, and anything that's moving uphill or north under climate change circumstances is doing the right thing? Is there a restoration model for North America under climate change that would make good use of these mountain ranges?
Tom?
Well, I think the answer to that is yes, although I couldn't give you a detailed response. And I don't think the issue of what you call a species moving in response to changing climate is an invasive species. I mean, that can be dealt with. I mean, that's sort of a definitional absurdity.
Stuart, let me offer some additional thoughts. When I chaired the Department of the Interior's Climate Change Task Force, that was precisely among the questions that we examined. And the Fish and Wildlife Service, following on from that effort, has actually paid a lot of attention to thinking about the wildlife refuge system, whether it needs to rethink those boundaries and create connectivity, looked at the Endangered Species Act and its regulatory provisions, and asking questions about those species that move and how it designates critical habitat, which historically has always backcast, looked at previous range. Is that the right framework in the context of a changing climate? So that thinking is going on, and indeed they have actually issued a kind of strategy, if you will. It still needs a lot of refinement.
I'm going to move to lightning rounds. Go for it. Yes. No, that's fine.
I'm Nathan Rowledge. I run a local resource conservation organization. And I guess I'm curious to hear on your level of concern regarding the increased rates of biodiversity loss and what that means in respect to restoration. Can we really predict what a future ecosystem would look like given the extinction we're experiencing?
Peter, you want to take that?
Sure. I think what that means is that we have to use every scrap of land and water as creatively as possible, and that's what it means to me. It is exactly that. Quick answer.
Hi, I'm John Stahura. I'm an environmental educator from Pennsylvania. I have 34 acres in Pennsylvania Pocono Mountains, and I had a wetland restoration designed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service about 15 years ago. And it's working really well for me and for the wood ducks that now nest there, as well as hooded mergansers and an occasional bittern and osprey and all kind of things that pass by. So I'm very pleased with it. But my question is one for the mammals. If you're going to restore an area specifically for mammals, don't you really have to have major corridors also preserved for that?
Ken? You want to?
Well, of course, the majority of mammals are bats and rodents. So probably, it depends on what kind of thing you're talking about. But even for your ducks, just because they can fly doesn't mean they don't need corridors and what have you to work with. So, I think it's this issue about starting to think at a portfolio scale and at a larger scale. So what would be cool would be if you find other people in your bioregion who but who also have wetlands and start to talk to each other about what's going on, because some of these things you only see these trends when you're looking at these broader scales. And I hope you have enough habitat so your wood turtles can go in and out in order to find estivation.
So I think we just should be working very hard to put as many connections back in the natural landscape as we possibly can. And if one buys the projections of the urbanization of humanity, I think by 2030 it's predicted that 80% of humanity will be in cities. Maybe it's 2050, I don't remember exactly. But that creates opportunities that might not have been there before.
Can I inject another issue that is a non-science one, but rather a governance one? One of the challenges that I have perceived in these large landscape efforts and indeed these corridor efforts is that our institutional design is not well aligned with that prospect. You have multiple agencies with dispersed responsibilities. You have these challenges that cut across jurisdictions and property ownerships. And even within the Bureau of Land Management, the land unit scale at which they do their planning is actually too small to identify those corridors in its land use plans and then make decisions accordingly. So I just want to leave that bee in a bonnet as a major challenge as we take the visions of the scientists at this table on that subject and how to translate it into management actions in a political context.
Go ahead.
Troy Abel from Huxley College, and I'd like to hear how participatory the reforestation, the urban reforestation in Rio was, how broadly participatory it was, because isn't it really a question of norms, not values? We can realign values, but values are pretty much established by the time we're in our 20s. What is much more malleable and institutional design applies to, and maybe we have some Eleanor Ostrom types in the room, but it's about modifying norms, and social psychologists, philosophers are having a really creative discussion right now about ecological citizenship.
Right.
The prairie restoration in Chicago failed on the ecological side, but Andrew Light suggests it was successful on the civic side because of its participation.
Okay.
Thank you.
Norms or values?
So, I think...
Great question.
I think it has to be participatory. Now, in 1865, the emperor just said, do it, right?
Can I say something about the norms part? I've been very interested in some of the work that has just come to my attention. I don't know, I'm sure it has a longer history, about how wrong we've gotten the signage in national parks, and that, in fact, when you tell people not to do things, that inclines them to do it more frequently. And there are a whole set of really interesting suggestions about ranging from the kinds of signage you put in your hotel room about reuse of towels and water. So I think we on this kind of conservation side may have been completely wrong-footed on many of these things, and that some of this emerging science is going to be extremely important for us to modify the way we're talking about. Yep. Conservation psychology, yeah.
Let the questions come.
Sure. I want to ask you to build on what Tom said about urbanization, because it strikes me that actually, as we go forward in this century, we are going to be trying to harvest more resources from natural systems, but we're actually going to be forced to reduce the total scale of our just occupied footprint, because we won't be able to afford to live in the suburban way we live now. A lot of land in California that isn't currently thought of as a water supply is going to have to become a water supply. How do we make sure that as this withdrawal takes place, that we actually capture that opportunity instead of just leaving behind things that used to be suburbs or used to be wheat farms in Nebraska, but are still so chopped up that they don't provide any kind of ecological service?
Who wants to take that?
You know, there's, an interesting case, since you mentioned California, is because of balancing the budget, the recent possibility of taking the tax breaks off for the ranches. And so now, ranchers get a tax break and you take it off. So you have to think, I actually think that is the challenge, as there's economic pressures and transitions and new patterns of settlement, there will have to be economic incentives that capture what Tom talked about. But I don't think it's that hard. The science is solid enough that you can measure and quantify infiltration rates for habitats. And you could quantify, the treatment costs of water. It's a matter of, instead of us taking the time to do biodiversity inventories, we'll also have to take the time to do the quantification of this stuff. But it's pretty solid. It's not arm waving, and I think it will get traction. It'll get traction partly because of the budget crisis.
I think there are two issues, Carl, with that, or many, but two that I want to focus on. One is first the challenge of valuing those ecosystem services, if you will, for their source water protection, for their water filtering purposes and so forth. And I think Peter's quite right. We have the capacity and ability and methodologies to do that. But I get back to, perhaps as a political scientist, the question, again, of institutions. I recently learned that Tucson, until last year, had no conversation between their water district and their land use planners. None.
Wow.
That has to change. Portland, I think, offers a model. Portland has attempted actually not only to look at the city and pull all of its agencies with their dispersed responsibilities into an overall conversation, but then link that externally to the exurban or rural adjacent areas and look at that whole thing as a system and think about its water supply in the future and whether the city ought to be investing externally in the protection of those systems. So we have the tiptoeing in of a few places that give us an institutional model to get at some of the challenges that you raise.
And you know, the silver lining of climate change is it's actually forcing a lot of governments and cities and institutions to do that. It forces us to make projections and see what demands and supplies are going to be.
So I can't resist Carl's vision of a vanishing suburbia to say, well, maybe a day will come we'll actually need to create a Scarsdale National Park, so we have an example.
Not perfect. Let it go.
Like the condor. Stood.
Building preservationists will handle that one. The American chestnut dominated the eastern deciduous forest. It was like 40% at the end of the 19th century, and then by 1920s, thanks to an invasive fungus, was totally gone. And lots of breeding, lots of efforts haven't replaced them. There's a genetically slightly engineered American chestnut that apparently may well survive, and I know that several members of this panel think it would be swell to see if that will go forward. Let me raise the ante. I'm in email discussion right now with George Church at Harvard and Edward O. Wilson. George Church is a genetic engineer of everything that Creighton Enter does. He does it with George's tools. And so my question to George was, can we bring back the passenger pigeon, which also perished in, 1914? And the answer I'm starting to get from George is probably for less than the cost of reviving the condor in this decade, we could bring back the passenger pigeon. My question to you is, should we do it?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's even more advanced for mammoths than it is for passenger pigeons. The Japanese have said they want to do it, and there's some indication that there's a reasonable percentage of the genome currently available to be able to do that. And then you have the people who say, there's some very large percentage of the bird genome which is non-expressed. I don't know if you know that, just the genes are not turned on. And there are a set of people who say that if you could turn those genes on, you could bring back dinosaurs. That in fact, that's what's gone on, is you've turned off that genetic material. And so, we are just at the beginning of this. And speaking of the role of young people, all of the experimentation with genetic blocks is going to bring us into a place where it isn't going to be old species we're bringing back. It's going to be, does biodiversity include new forms of life that are unrelated to anything currently existing on Earth? The passenger pigeon, I think, will be an ecological question. There's some indication that it was Indian burning and that was associated with the creation of enough field crops that would allow them to come to the ground and feed. So it's hard to see where you would get the forage necessary to do more than have a few of them, which we wouldn't probably exhibit in the Bronx Zoo, but I'm sure Disneyland would put them on right away, or Busch Gardens and what have you. So that's why the question of what restoring means. Does it mean one individual it's sustained forever, or are you talking about the tens of millions, the flock sizes that it would have to have before you would consider it success?
What do you think, Tom?
So I don't think the conditions are there to get the flock sizes that were historical. But I would be surprised if you couldn't get a reasonable sized flock, and I think the value of it would be so much greater than just doing the return of the passenger pigeon. It would be very symbolic, very awakening for the public.
But this raises a different issue, and I'm not going. Being a birder, I'd love the passenger pigeon to be back, but we'll set that aside. I went out hunting for it, but I think
Did he find anything?
7 other species of woodpeckers. But I think the raising of the passenger pigeon, let us ratchet forward to now. I mean, that was one of the ecological disasters, a bird of which there were billions, and somehow we as human beings could not stop our destruction to the point where they went extinct. It seems to me, as we're talking here about restoration, however you want to define it, rewilding, recreating, creating something new, at the same time that that's going on, we continue apace with dike building. I'm involved in a project in which, after Hurricane Ike and its damage to Galveston, there was a proposal in Texas to extend the Galveston seawall by 70 miles, something that was dubbed Ike's Dike. I mean, this still remains the perspective that we often apply to current situations. Land fragmentation, still the planting of monocultures. So I guess I take your question about the passenger pigeon in a different direction. And as we talk restoration, ask what is the flip side of that coin in terms of our responsibility to prevent further degradation?
Right. So on that question,
Preventative restoration is called.
wouldn't if we had the ability to bring back something like the passenger pigeon, wouldn't it make it more likely that we would care less about those things that are on the brink today? Sarah Palin was in California a few weeks ago and made a fantastic statement in front of her constituencies about the minnow that is stopping irrigation in the bay, saying that in Alaska, you call it endangered species here, but in Alaska we call it bait. Wouldn't we more likely let those things go, just certain in the knowledge that, well, if we needed it, we can bring it back?
So I think partly that would be one of the outcomes, unless, I mean, and it speaks to, I think Kent hit it on the head, if you're bringing them back as a museum piece, even that just seems ridiculous. But if they're a major player in an intact ecosystem,
Which the Midwest is not.
yeah, but that's why if you were taking enough action to manage and have an intact ecosystem at a large scale, then I think it's a serious discussion. I'm absolutely certain as museum pieces, it just doesn't, and there's a certain, we have to worry about that because there's going to be a sort of technological lure of the museum piece approach to this and the cool factor, and you have to back off that and say, so what is it we're actually getting with this? So that's why I say it's what do we, it's what is the ecosystem we want? It's not what is the species we want, because you can't do it. It's what is the ecosystem we want, and it's going to be at a place.
Last question.
So I would think that the amount of times that would actually encourage an extinction would be relatively small, just because it's always easier to prevent something than to recreate it.
I am from North Carolina, where only 8% of the land mass is actually publicly owned in some sort of, and the average land owned by foresters and farmers is about 100 acres. That's average size. So when you talk about restoration ecology in that landscape, it gets really, really hard with private land ownership, especially in the state of Jesse Helms. This is just my experience. But we have some incredible successes with restoring the longleaf pine ecosystem, and it happens to be happening on Fort Bragg Military Base in several of our national forests. The Great Red Wolf Restoration Project going on in the Alligator Swamp Refuge, which is a fish and wildlife refuge. So we're having great things happening on public lands, and I just want to make the point, then I want to ask you a little bit in your thoughts on more federal ownership. I think I know the answer based on the answer to the last few questions. We have a vehicle to do this. It's the Land and Water Conservation Fund that derives all its funding from offshore oil drilling. At a time when we had the worst oil disaster ever, we had the greatest revenues ever in that fund, $17 billion. We had some of the lowest levels of funding. Effectively, the federal government has gotten out of the business of land conservation at a time when we're having these conversations. So I guess my question is, talking about, can we really do any of this in a world that's getting more and more private without any expectation or hope of more public land ownership to do this work?
Sure. Quick comment back. And it's the last question. So, Lynn, would you like to?
Yeah. So two responses. One, there are great opportunities to proceed with what increasingly folks dub collaborative conservation, that is, stitching together the works and coordinating the efforts of multiple private landowners. Such efforts are writ large across the landscape. One thinks of the Blackfoot Challenge. TNC's been involved in that in Montana. But to your question about LWCF, I think at this juncture it is absolutely critical that this nation rebuild its financial commitment to investing in conservation. The challenge is, right now, you've got deficit driving all that discussion, and I think, while I was in Interior, I went and tried to get a bill on conservation, and here's the response I got from my Republican colleagues. Either I got, I don't do environment, and that was the good end of the discussion, and the other end was, oh, there's got to be something bad about property rights in here. So the challenge is, what language do we need to use to underscore the importance of these investments? And I think this gets back to some of the ecosystem services discussion. To the degree one can demonstrate that these investments are investments, yes, in species and wildlife and natural places, but they also sustain basic human services, clean water, source water. I think that's got to be a critical part of that message, whether we like it or not.
That's it for time. Thank you guys so much for coming out today.
You did a good job moving us along. I said he did a good job moving it along.
You guys did great.
You did a great job.
Yeah. We had more questions.